As the group traveled, they heard many stories of discrimination and horrible violence. Some of the incidents that stood out in the minds of our group are comments from Moira Heffron, Joan Hoffman, and Karen Weiberg. They will share their thoughts in their own words.
Charles Avery and Carolyn McKinstry, foot soldiers, whom we met in Birmingham, Alabama, described their experiences as students in segregated schools and the stringent restrictions placed on them and their families in daily life. Their academic achievements were measured in a completely separate track from that of white students. Talented Black students might be offered scholarship money for college, but only out of state. Despite all the discrimination, it must have been terrifying to confront Jim Crow.
As a former elementary teacher, I was appalled at the unfairness of the Black schools as compared to the white schools. In 1944, there were 42.5 students per Black teacher, while there were only 24.3 students per white teacher. Black teachers were expected to teach more students for 60% of their salary than the white teachers. In 1947, a lawsuit equalized salaries for Black and white teachers, but white teachers were given extra funds for needed supplies, and the Black teachers had to use their own money.
We visited the 16th Avenue Baptist Church in Birmingham, where 4 little girls lost their lives when a bomb planted in a window well exploded just as church services were about to begin. At Kelly Ingram Park nearby, Reverend Calvin Woods led us in song and prayer. That park is filled with sculptures of the 4 little girls in their Sunday best, and of the police dogs and fire hoses Sheriff Bull Connors turned on the brave children in the Children's March. Particularly poignant was the trauma expressed by Carolyn McKinstry after the church bombing, when she said no one wanted to talk about it. It was like the word cancer. No one wanted to say it out loud or acknowledge it. We traveled to Selma, Alabama, on that lonely highway where Viola Liuzzo was murdered while transporting marchers. A white woman from Detroit, she had felt compelled to leave her husband and family to stand up for the cause. She was murdered as much for crossing the color line as for joining the protest. After our church supper in Selma, we met with fiery activist Joanne Bland, who participated as a child in Bloody Sunday, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge depicted in the movie Selma. After we had crossed the bridge, we went to a Confederate cemetery where we saw the memorial to General Nathan Bedford Forrest, defender of Selma, more accurately known as the Butcher of Fort Pillow and Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. The Edmund Pettus Bridge is still named for the Confederate officer who was a Grand Dragon of the KKK. In Montgomery, Alabama, on the Capitol grounds, we saw a statue of Dr. Marion Sims, father of modern gynecology. He perfected his surgical skills by operating on enslaved women without anesthesia. The restaurant where we ate was adjacent to the slave warehouses where people were brought up from the river, warehoused, and auctioned off. How could we eat a casual meal there in that restaurant with its unfortunate red walls inside a slave warehouse?
One of the nice things about traveling with Leslie and Mark, we didn't ever have to think about where we wanted to eat. So our second night, we went to an Italian restaurant just in the same block as our hotel. And I was sitting between Grace and Frida and quite hungry. We'd had a long day and had been learning a lot. And Leslie was across the way from me. And as we were passing some appetizer around, she said that this was a building that was used to fatten the slaves when they came off the boat on the Montgomery River. And there were stalls, essentially. And I just couldn't really eat much after that. That was just shocking news to me. I just couldn't believe that they were treated like animals. And the next morning we went up to see where the auction blocks were. We visited the Equal Justice Initiative, the Legacy Museum in Birmingham. And after my ticket was scanned, you walk down a ramp, and all of a sudden there were these holograms that started talking to you. And so I paused and listened to the first one. And they were actually slaves telling their stories. Then they were in these stalls that we had talked about the night before at the restaurant. And they were talking about how they were captured, their trip across the ocean, feelings of when children were taken from them, from spouses being taken from them, families being broken apart. And it was just really mesmerizing to me. I also had one person who talked about what happened to him after he was escaped and then was captured. And, you know, the museum was directly behind that restaurant that we had eaten in the night before, same building. And that was just a really powerful part of our stay in Montgomery for me. As I walked further into the museum, there was a huge picture. It was from the ceiling to the floor. And it was a picture of a teenage boy, an inmate. He was in his striped uniform, but he was chained to a pickaxe. His neck was at the point of the pickaxe, and he was laying on his side, curled. So his arms were around the pickaxe, and he was laying on his side. And if he moved, he would cut his throat and probably that artery there. And I just didn't sleep that night. That picture is burned into my memory. I can see it like any of the traumatic things that I've seen in my life. And it just reinforced what people are willing to do to other human beings when there's greed and power. Because after the Civil War, Black men were imprisoned for the most minor of things. Every speaker that we heard on this trip and place that we visited had violence against other humans as part of their core story of being an African American working to get the right to vote, to register, to be able to vote, and really just to exist and seen as a human being. I invite you to join me in speaking up for those who do not have a voice, or their voice is suppressed. And secondly, to listen to stories and then believe those stories. Every day there was an example of good people going along rather than doing what they really knew was right. As a woman, I can relate a tiny, tiny bit, but not nearly enough to understand what so many of those who shared their stories with us have to live through every day. After George Floyd was killed, I rejoined the Nativity Racial Equity and Justice team.